Kia ora, ko Lu tōku ingoa no ngā motu aho. I'm a health coach. I'm based in New Plymouth, and I work with neurodivergent adults, mostly people who have been diagnosed or self-identify as autistic, ADHD, or DHD. They might identify as gifted or as highly sensitive. And that coaching's around ways forward that support their well-being and work with their own mind and their own ways of being. So I'm neurodivergent myself. I came to that understanding as an adult, and I'm also a parent of a neurodivergent teenager. So this is both personal and professional for me, and a big part of why this growing understanding among people who support others matters so much to me. So this is the third webinar in this neurodiversity series with Ignite. So if you were here with us, particularly for the first one, you'll have a little bit more context about the way that I approach things. So when I talk about neurodivergence, I'm talking about the broad range of different ways that people might show up, think, experience the world that might not necessarily fit our societal assumptions about how most people are. But today's session is going to specifically focus on autistic and ADHD experiences and what supportive practice there might look like. So I want to acknowledge who might be on this call today. I can't see you all, but you might work in a community context where you're seeing lots of people. Might be in a therapeutic profession or a well-being role within an organization. But whatever that looks like for you, if you're supporting other people in some way, you will be coming across neurodivergent people, including people who are autistic or ADHD or both, whether they identify themselves that way or not. And having some understanding of their internal experiences, of why you might see certain outward expressions, of how to support and affirm their needs. That's what we're about here today. And I also want to acknowledge that this might be more personal for you. As we go through the session, you might recognize your own experience or find yourself thinking about someone in your family or your close circle. If that's you, I hope that this feels really validating and affirming for you as well. So something that we touched on in the first webinar of this series, and I want to look at just a bit more closely as our framing today, is that there are these two quite different lenses through which we might understand neurodivergence, and particularly ADHD and autism. And these two lenses can make quite a difference to our approach. And yeah, like I am drawing a contrast between these here, but I know that we can hold both in tension, and a lot of people in their practice do. So diagnosis comes more from that pathological lens. So a clinician looks for signs of not being able to meet some kind of social standard of functioning and ties that to deficits within the person. And, diagnosis itself does serve a purpose, but that's not the only lens we can use for understanding autism and ADHD. And for a lot of people, that doesn't really reflect the way that they see themselves. A neurodiversity affirming lens starts with the recognition that human minds are naturally varied, that there have always been and always will be neurodivergent people. And it considers how much of what looks like difficulty can actually come from a mismatch between the person and the environment they're in. It also values a person's own self-understanding and insights and their priorities and what matters to them. So as we go through the rest of the session today, you might notice that what I'm describing doesn't always neatly map onto diagnostic criteria. So instead, we're going to be looking at recognizing the range of experiences that are associated with autism and ADHD. So I hope that even using this lens can be an encouragement that as a support person, you don't have to be an expert. You just need to be open and curious about the person in front of you. So why are we focusing on autism and ADHD for this session? apart from it being what I personally have the most understanding in and the most to offer you, there are a few reasons why I think this is especially important if you're in a role that supports people. So first, just to note, there is a huge overlap between people who are autistic and ADHD. So someone might only have one diagnosis or might identify with one of these, but many people also strongly relate to experiences associated with the other. And there's a huge overlap of people who are diagnosed as ADHD or autistic and ADHD. So we're not necessarily talking about like two separate groups, autistic people, ADHD is. Often, these might be different aspects of one person's experience. Both autism and ADHD describe neurodivergent experiences that a person carries throughout their whole life. Both of them have strong hereditary components. So what I mean by that is if one person in a family is diagnosed or identifies this way, chances are there are going to be others within their family who share those experiences too. You've probably seen that plenty. So good support that fosters positive self-understanding can genuinely have a generational impact. And if you're in a support role, particularly in youth or adult mental health or another kind of wellbeing context, you've probably noticed that there is this growing number of people who are identifying this way. Even if you're not seeing that, you will be working with autistic and ADHD people. And one of the reasons we can be pretty sure of that is because the statistics around mental health are not great for autistic and ADHD adults. Anxiety and depression are significantly more common. Roughly 8 in 10 autistic adults experience mental health struggles at some point in their life, compared to about 1 in 4 of the general population. Rates of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts are substantially higher, and all of these are well-researched findings. And the risk is highest not for people who have really obvious differences that stand out to others, but actually for people who have higher cognitive abilities and people who seem to fit in socially okay. So people are often carrying this sense of being different without quite understanding why. Being misunderstood, judged, or having their needs overlooked or dismissed. That whole social and psychological weight is often a significant part of why people get stuck. And this is why understanding how our minds work in a positive and affirming way is so crucial to this kind of well-being support. And I want to pause on this for a moment before we move on. So this comes from a 2023 report for a National Eating Disorders Collaboration. And while eating disorders are the focus of this particular report, it's this really comprehensive look at research on neurodivergence and mental health more broadly. So well worth a read. Just to read this out to you, research suggests a positive neurodivergent identity marked by pride and acceptance may protect mental health, foster self-advocacy, and support long-term recovery. Okay, so let's look at autism. And just briefly clarifying some of the language around this. We talk about the autism spectrum. So that's the formal diagnosis that encompasses all of these related experiences. So to be clear, spectrum doesn't mean a scale from mild on one end to severe at the other. And we don't use language like high functioning or low functioning. But what a spectrum means is that the range of autistic experiences is really wide. Each person has their own individual profile of strengths and support needs. So a color spectrum is a much more helpful way to think about this. And on language, there's been this big shift over the last 10 years or so towards a preference for identity-first language, describing a person as autistic or, I am autistic, rather than they have autism or they have ASD, which is what I hear quite a lot of support people use. The reason for this is that for a lot of people, autism isn't something that's separate to who they are. It's part of them. I identify as autistic myself, well, as an ADHD. A lot of people will look at the language that you use as an indicator of whether you see them through an affirming or deficit lens. So I really want to encourage you to prioritize this language. So one of the things that makes autism really hard to understand from the outside is that outward expressions can look so different from person to person, and they can seem like completely unrelated to each other. And those traits that you might associate with autism can seem kind of random. But there is this pattern of connected experiences. So I'm going to use this metaphor to help us pull it together. I hope you can follow. I hope you find this helpful. Imagine the brain being like a motorway system. Information is the traffic, and in the middle is this big roundabout that represents where conscious processing happens. The thinking, the noticing, the planning. So for most people, a lot of that information traffic is diverted away from the roundabout. Might be filtered out, skipped over, processed subconsciously. But for those of us who are autistic, there seems to be a lot more traffic on this conscious roundabout. So let's look at three main sources of that traffic. The first source, which I think is probably the most obvious way that input comes into our minds, is through our senses. I want to just ask you for a moment here to tune into the room that you're in right now. Are there any background noises? Can you feel the chair that you're sitting in? Your clothes against your skin? Were you aware of all of this before I drew your attention towards it? So some of that you might say yes, some of it you might say no. All of us filter out sensory input to some degree, but this tends to be experienced differently by those of us who are autistic. We might be extra aware of all that input, or it might all be coming in as so much noise that it's quite hard to distinguish one thing from another. But either way, it's often still having an impact on our stress response. So when we find something particularly unpleasant or annoying and we can't just tune it out, it really contributes to that stress load. And on the flip side, sensory input that we happen to find really soothing or pleasant or satisfying can actually be particularly valuable for calming that stress response. And, what feels pleasant or unpleasant differs from person to person. But it's worth knowing that these two things often go together. The source of the struggle can also give you a hint at what could be really helpful for calming down as well. So those five senses that I have on the picture on the left, they're all pretty obvious ones, so we won't go into that in any great detail. But there are three other senses that are worth knowing about that might not immediately come to mind. Proprioception, so that's the awareness of where your body is in space. So anything that's pressing against the surface of it gives proprioceptive input. So think weighted blankets, firm pressure, vestibular sense. That's that balance and movement sense. So, swaying, spinning, hanging upside down, that's all vestibular input. And interoception. So that is the awareness of internal body signals. So, your feeling of hunger, thirst, pain, emotions are generally, a connection between the feelings that you're feeling inside your body and the way that we're understanding them. And interoception is one that's particularly worth noting because with that high mental load, that a lot of input, some people might be extra sensitive to those internal sensations, but other people, and what's kind of more common for autistic people, is finding it genuinely hard to notice them or name them. So that can affect the way that we might notice hunger cues, pain perception, even like recognizing and naming our emotions might not feel like a really straightforward process. So that's all just worth knowing about how we might be experiencing things. Looking at more traffic on that roundabout, social situations involve a huge amount of complex input. So that's another major source of traffic. And, social situations, the input is not just the words that people say, but that's body language, facial expressions, tone, unspoken norms, figures of speech, context. And most of this is culturally shaped. So for most people, engaging in this kind of way becomes largely automatic and subconscious over time. And that's where I've used this image here of an underpass going under the roundabout. It's like, it takes that mental traffic straight past the roundabout without it needing to be consciously processed. But for those of us who are autistic, a lot of this needs to be consciously processed. We need to notice those cues, think about what they mean within the context. All of that takes effort. When somebody asks, "How are you?" Oh, is this one of those situations where they're asking just out of politeness and I'm meant to just give a rote answer, or are they actually asking this time? That's all quite a lot to have to process if that's not just happening automatically. It does take effort. And if someone is also managing how they come across, the way they respond, making sure their own responses match what's expected of them, that is all more traffic on top of that load. And so some autistic people, really socially observant, put in a lot of energy into navigating these interactions, and might not stand out as being different to the people around them in any way. For some people, it's genuinely just not a priority for them. You get what you get, fair enough. And some people really just don't have that capacity. No matter how hard they try, they're not going to be sort of fitting within those social norms. But whether or not someone seems to be fitting in or not, it's often in this space, in this social space, that sense of being different or of being misjudged or misunderstood can have the deepest impact. And in autism research, there is this concept called the double empathy problem. And that describes how when there's a difficulty in communication between an autistic person and a non-autistic person, that difficulty actually goes both ways. So too often it's the autistic person who's judged as doing it wrong, not understanding, not showing empathy. But usually the autistic person is experiencing exactly the same thing in the other direction. So it can be much more helpful to think of this as a cultural mismatch, and that it's going to take curiosity and grace on both sides to close that communication gap and to understand one another. And that's why, even for us those of us who seem to navigate social situations pretty fluently, having people we can spend time with in ways that feel easy and uncomplicated, that come more naturally to us, where we feel seen and understood, that is really important. So generally, one-on-one interactions around shared interests with similar communication styles tend to be easier, especially when you don't have these subtle hints or hierarchies to navigate and all of that. But it differs from person to person. So each person, really up to them to explore for themselves what kind of situations they feel most relaxed, most comfortable, most affirmed, most themselves, and prioritize making those connections and spending time with those people. Looking at the third source of traffic that I want to name is about differences in the way we think. So this isn't part of that diagnostic criteria specifically, but both the strengths and challenges that come up with it are so often misunderstood. So I think it's really worth looking at. So most people seem to use this top-down approach to thinking. So start with the general picture, fill in the gaps using prior knowledge or assumptions, and then get going. It's pretty efficient. Generally results in doing things the same way as the people around you. And it's only if there's really a need that more questions will be asked that might be, diving deeper into the details. But what seems to be more common for autistic people is to build information with a bottom-up approach. So we tend to collect details first and build up understanding from there. So that might mean needing more context before acting, asking more questions, taking longer to reach a conclusion. And there can be huge strengths that come with this. And for a lot of people, this is where their greatest strengths might come from. Deep analysis, creative problem solving, outside the box thinking, pattern recognition, noticing things that other people overlook. But when we're in environments that expect quick responses, unthinking compliance, this way of thinking can tend to come with negative feedback. And when we've built an understanding with all of that detailed traffic flowing well from the bottom up, changes in direction can be a lot more traffic on that roundabout. They can be genuinely overwhelming. Last minute change of plans. That means reassessing everything from scratch. And this is also why a lot of autistic people resist CBT style approaches. So if that looks like quickly reframing conclusions that we have carefully built up, to try and do this misunderstands how we arrived at those conclusions. So a lot more useful is getting curious about how someone came to that conclusion, where that's come from, how they've built that, and then looking at it again from the bottom up. So when all that traffic piles up, that sensory input, the social processing, bottom-up detail gathering, it can lead to overwhelm. Gridlock on the roundabout. There's too much coming in, not enough capacity to process it all. There's no room to move. And this can show up as really high stress and anxiety, intense emotional reactions, or it might be shutting down and disengaging. When someone's in that state, trying to reason or problem solve or work through things logically, which might be what they're inclined to do, just doesn't work. There's no more room on the roundabout. There's no capacity for that. How you support somebody who's in this kind of shutdown or meltdown state really depends on your role and scope. But I hope that just understanding what's going on, not pushing for cognitive engagement when somebody just isn't in a state to access it, that's genuinely helpful. But we want to look here at ways that we can clear the gridlock when it builds up. But it's also worth understanding that a lot of what we think of as autistic traits are actually natural strategies that we've developed for managing that high traffic load. They're not just meaningless quirks. They're often valuable supports. So looking at these just briefly, what we call stimming, that's engaging with sensory input that we find calming and satisfying, which really supports that nervous system regulation. Structured routines, doing things in the same kind of way each time reduces the traffic from decisions and uncertainty. And time spent deeply focused on our passionate interests, that we might have built an understanding in that detailed bottom-up way. That's where traffic can flow freely, and it's hugely satisfying and positive for our sense of self. So when you see behavior that you can't relate to or you don't understand, it's really worth getting curious. What need might this be serving? Is it causing harm, or is it actually helping? Because the goal should never be to make somebody seem more typical, but more about supporting them to understand and honor their own needs and their own ways of being. And I want to end this autism section by noting that through all of this, we've been talking about differences. And yes, there can be real challenges associated with those differences. But through all of this, there are strengths as well. And I hesitate to just kind of give you a list of autistic strengths because everybody is different. But I do encourage you to really explore this with the people you support and notice that so often what people bring to the world isn't separate from how their mind works. It's all inseparable and part of the same system. And it's all part of what we need to understand and support in order to thrive. Moving on to ADHD experiences and remembering that these aren't necessarily different people with different experiences. They can be part of the same way of being. So if autism is about the volume of traffic on the roundabout, I want to extend that metaphor and look at ADHD as being about what fuels that traffic. So the traffic, input, thoughts, tasks, that needs fuel to get moving. And for most people, there's more or less enough fuel in the system to keep things flowing steadily. But for ADHDers, those vehicles need significantly more fuel to get going. And the source of fuel is stimulation. What do I mean by stimulation? Pretty much, and I'll, pretend to be a neuroscientist here, but anything that produces high levels of neurochemicals, dopamine, norepinephrine, that varies from person to person, but generally, the things that might bring that stimulation are things we find genuinely interesting, things that are novel or new, big emotions, urgency and stress, risk, reward, pleasure, maybe competition, being around other people. So some of that traffic, some of those tasks and input and information comes loaded with fuel. So those tasks take off fast. And others might really struggle to get going, even when they matter, even when we really want to do them, because there's just no fuel attached to them. When that whole system is running low, it can be really uncomfortable. Immense boredom, restlessness, flatness, and inability to get started on things that you even really want to do. So this is why when we talk about ADHD difficulties, we often talk about executive function. So executive function covers all of the processes that are involved in carrying out a task from start to finish. That motivation to get started, planning it, remembering what you're in the middle of when distractions come up or when you move from one room to another, keeping track of the time that you're taking. So if fuel runs low at any of these points, or attention gets pulled into something that's more stimulating, a task can stall. Big emotions can be really stimulating as well. So if we hit a frustration, that feeling of frustration can shoot out in front and take over. Anxious thoughts or ruminations can pull a lot of attention because they are really emotionally charged. They are really stimulating. They come with a lot of fuel. And I want to point out here, which is why I've given you this visual, is that often people will identify either with attention regulation or hyperactivity and impulsivity being their dominant experience, like the type of ADHD they relate most to. And often this is kind of part of that diagnostic lens as well. There are so many different ways that this can show up and be experienced without really clear-cut categories. But whether somebody looks like they're constantly on the go, always seeking more stimulation, working hard to keep that traffic momentum up, jumping from one thing to another, or whether they are stuck, staring into space, struggling to get moving on anything because the fuel has run dry, there is this commonality underneath. It is the same fuel system showing up differently. As we look at some of the ways that this experience might show up, I want to name something first. This slide I've made here, we're not looking at this as a list of problems on one side and a list of silver linings or superpowers on the other side. What we want to look at is one fuel system that shows up in different ways depending on the context. Some traits, the same experiences, the same traits can create challenges in some situations, and they often might be the source of real strength in others. And all of this will look different from person to person. So not everybody will experience all of these or relate to all of these. But let's look at a few of them a little bit closer. Because I think if you understand that fuel system, a lot of them start to make more sense. So procrastination. From the outside, this might look to some people like laziness or avoidance. But what's actually happening is the task doesn't have enough fuel to get moving, to get that traffic moving. And feeling bad about it tends to drain out more fuel. What changes that is finding a way to bring more fuel, more stimulation to the task. So, that might look like finding an easier entry point to get started, pairing up with somebody else, like body doubling to do it together, putting on some music or something interesting in the background if it's a boring task, finding some way to make it more interesting to you. And exploring that for yourself will look different from person to person. Let's see, hyperactivity and fidgeting. Seeking fuel top-ups through movement or stimulation. That's not restlessness for no reason. It is the system trying to generate enough fuel to keep going. And it is not necessarily a problem. Sometimes this is a really effective strategy for keeping moving, for keeping that fuel up. But it is worth paying attention to if it's happening when the body actually needs some rest, which I think can take us to chronic stress and burnout. Urgency and pressure can be really effective fuel sources in the short term, but they're not sustainable. Running on stress consistently over time leads to burnout. And it's worth really looking at where that fuel source is being relied on and what other supports and approaches could be brought in, so that it's not just stress that's keep getting you going. And I've got on both sides here hyper focus, because when something has enough fuel, when it's genuinely interesting, when it's already up and moving, if it's challenging or meaningful to us, once it picks up speed, it can overtake everything else. And that can be a real strength. The challenge is that this kind of focus isn't always available when we want it. It can be hard to redirect when it kicks in. So again, same fuel system, two different experiences depending on the context. We've looked at some challenges that some ADHDers might experience and some strengths that they also might identify with. And I want to highlight again that these aren't separate from how the ADHD brain works or sort of strengths despite their ADHD. They come from the same fuel system. It's worth naming, it's worth reflecting back to the people you support or recognizing it in yourself. And looking at the tools and supports that we can access. Lots of people find medication really helpful. So, basically from my understanding, that boosts the overall fuel in the system, hopefully smooth out that traffic flow a bit. But whether or not medication is part of that support toolbox, it's most effective when you understand how your mind works and develop day-to-day approaches and strategies that work with that fuel system rather than against it. So exploring this, trying new approaches, putting them into practice, that might mean building genuine interest in something where possible, finding the parts of it that you're interested in, working with a body double, so alongside someone else who's doing the work as well and helps you kind of get motivated or keep it interesting, finding easier entry points into tasks, using movement, breaking things into smaller segments, building external reminders and systems. This is where a coach who specializes in neurodivergence or ADHD can be really helpful for, looking at each of these and supporting you to both brainstorm ideas of how you could approach things differently, reflecting on what's worked in past or been helpful in past, and putting that into practice and seeing how it goes, and problem solving from there. No, but this kind of very individual support is only part of that picture, because on the other side, we have the environment we're in, the people around us, being able to do things differently in the ways that work for us, supported to use those strategies and approaches. That makes a huge difference. And not being judged for our difficulties and for the mistakes that we might make. There is so much shame that can come from years of people assuming that we're just not trying hard enough or we don't care enough. So those understanding, supportive relationships and environments are really crucial to well-being. We're kind of wrapping up here, and we have covered a lot in this session. Autistic and ADHD experiences are so hugely varied and complex. I'm not expecting you to remember every detail here, but as we close, I want to focus on what you can offer, whatever your role, that I hope you'll keep in mind. Firstly, curiosity beats assumptions every time. The person in front of you knows their own experience better than any diagnostic checklist. So your job is to be genuinely interested in that. Outward behavior makes a lot more sense when you understand what might be happening on the inside. So again, that curiosity. Could this be about managing a high traffic load, or about keeping the traffic fueled up and flowing? So I hope that maybe those images will be something that you return to. Strengths and challenges so often come from the same place. That same brain that struggles in one environment can bring something remarkable in another. So that is worth noticing and reflecting back. Working with someone's brain, not against it, that is where the real change becomes possible. So not asking people to override the ways that they experience things, or that they prefer to do things, or that they've found helpful in past, but supporting them to understand themselves and to find what's going to work for them. And finally, being seen and understood is itself protective for mental health. The research backs this up. You don't need to be a clinician or an expert, or to know a formal diagnosis in order to offer that. You just need to show up with openness, to take what people say about themselves seriously, and be willing to be curious. So that's really what neurodiversity affirming support looks like in practice. It's something that everybody on this call has the capacity to be able to offer. So thank you for being here today. If you want to dive deeper into autism and ADHD with this neurodiversity affirming lens, I've put together a resource list with some books and podcasts and websites that generally come from people sharing out of that neurodiversity affirming position, and from their own experiences as well. And so Marissa will put a link to this resource in the chat, and I will hand it over to her for your questions now.
Great, thanks for that, Lou. I'm just having an issue putting it in the chat in a second, but I'll chuck it in there as soon as I can, guys. Bear with me. Cool. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to chuck them in the Q&A function now. Just while we're waiting for that, I've got a couple ready to go. How do we support, or how would you recommend supporting somebody who struggles to maybe articulate what they need?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that you can explore together. Yeah, it is really difficult because, we can't read people's minds. And if they don't know what they need, this is an ongoing exploration. Yeah.
True.
Sometimes that's where, and I hope that these images might help for kind of looking at it through that lens and going, is do you need more stimulation, or is this all a bit much and you need to sort of simplify things down and take it down a little bit? Yeah.
Gotcha. Great. Um, how do we avoid making assumptions about someone's needs?
Think again, getting curious, like actually, engaging with the person that's in front of you. Yeah.
Cool. Wait, is there any questions from anybody on the call? Cool. You mentioned about burnout. Are the signals that someone may be experiencing burnout different for those who maybe have autism or ADHD or any type of neurodiversity?
Yeah, well, I think, especially if you're, and I think of particularly that image of the roundabout with the traffic jam. And I like this image of some of those lanes needing to be shut down for maintenance. If you're reaching that point just too often, or if there's just far too much traffic load regularly. So often people find that their capacity to deal with anything is significantly reduced. So that might mean capacity to deal with sensory input, and things that used to be like manageable and now just like overwhelming, decision making, sometimes even, engaging with things that you're really interested and passionate about just feels like too much.
Hmm.
So, again, might look different than just that kind of like one area of your life that has become too much and stepping back from that, but it often seems to flow over everything. So um, I've heard autistic burnout sort of particularly being compared to how people experience a traumatic brain injury. Often that
Wow.
just actually needing to rest your brain and recover can be part of that.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. How might we respond if somebody's needs seem like inconsistent or can change from day to day type of thing?
Yeah, that can be such a tricky one and is really common. And of course, there's all sorts of other things that kind of come into play with all of those experiences and how I suppose how like resilient we might be in the moment. Everybody struggles more, with things like lack of sleep, hormonal changes can make a difference. So that is a frustrating one. And when we don't know ourselves, if those of us who are neurodivergent, sort of what capacity we'll have day to day, that just having some compassion around that.
Hmm.
Um,
A little bit of wiggle room as well, right?
yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
That if there is one thing that we're committing to that's really important, and we don't know if we're going to be able to manage it on that day or going to have the capacity to, then, what else can we simplify down, right down? So, that knowing that that is one thing that's going to take a lot of that energy. So that energy planning and energy accounting is often a big part of kind of navigating this and yeah, looking at ways forward.
Hmm. So true. Thanks, Lou. If you believe some accommodations might help with somebody you support, but maybe you don't know if they have a diagnosis, or maybe they don't know, they don't know. Like, how do you recommend kind of approaching that safely? Like maybe what language would you maybe use when you don't know whether somebody is neurodivergent?
I think all of these experiences we could talk about just as easily without having like these names attached. So, you could have exactly the same conversation about like, oh, it is all like, a lot, or like, oh, you need to sort of, do you find that you need to bring in some more stimulation here or whatever, without necessarily using the language.
Hmm.
Um, Knowing that other people experience the same can be hugely helpful for people. So that is where that, positive neurodivergent identity comes in. But
Hmm.
any of this could be just as much part of the conversation, whether you whether you relate to all of the experiences, whether you want to use that autism or ADHD language, whether you have a diagnosis or not. So
Mm.
yeah, I don't think that it needs to be, just within those categories.
Great, thank you. Someone has asked, I'm the parent of a neurodivergent child. I'm finding it difficult to differentiate between bad behavior and overstimulation slash overwhelm. They don't have the language or self-awareness to tell them. Do you have any tips?
Oh man, it is so hard, right?
Mhm.
I I kind of as a starting point, I at least like the idea that children will do well when they can, and that sometimes that's much more of a long-term view, right?
Mm.
Um, so yeah, it depends so much on the situation, but I think, and again on the age of your children, but even just whether they're not able to engage in those conversations themselves, but whether it's kind of one-sided, like talking about things as like a shared problem solving, like, is this, yeah, what's going on here, and how can I help you to do this well?
Mm.
Yeah.
Cool. Great, thank you. Someone else has asked, what can we say? I think this is more personal question, but what can we say to buy some time or request space if we are feeling at capacity with inputs and feeling a bit overloaded? They'll feel worried it might sound defensive, and then finding the language is hard when you're right there, like in the moment.
Yeah, yeah. This is where, and again, sometimes if people won't hear us in the way that's intended, there's only, we only have so much control over that.
Mhm.
But we're getting comfortable with saying, oh, this is what I'm experiencing, and I really need this. So can I have? So, we look at this, what is going on for you? What is your need here? And what is your request of the other person?
Mhm.
Can make it not an accusation to them, or yeah, I think sets you up the best for them not being defensive. Again, you can't control that part of it, right?
Mm. Yeah.
But having some phrases to practice. I'm feeling really overwhelmed, and I really need some space here, or some time out. Can I go and have a bit of quiet time in my bedroom, or again, whatever that looks like.
Yeah. There's almost like a little script, right? Like I'm
Mm.
feeling insert like emotion here. This is what I need. Like it's yeah, that's really helpful. Thank
Yeah.
you.
With the people who are in our lives who we might be having those conversations with regularly,
Mm.
again, might not be understood the first time, but if that becomes something that you're coming back to again and again, then hopefully you'll sort of build an understanding together.
Great. Thank you. Is there any last minute questions, comments? Feel free to chuck them in the Q&A function or in the chat. Oh, great. Well, if nobody's got any more questions, would you like, oh, yep, no more questions. If you'd like to sort of close us off, I can close us off with a karakia.
Yeah.
Cool. Mate rongo ka mohio, mate mohio ka marama, mate marama ka mātou, mate mātou ka ora. Through listening comes awareness, through awareness comes understanding, through understanding comes knowledges, through knowledge comes life and well-being. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this, Lou. This whole series has been, yeah, super, super informative, and I'm sure, everybody's got a lot to take away from this. So yeah, just want to say thank you. Thank you to you, Lou, and thank you everybody for coming.